Hi, I'm Carmen.
And I'm Steven, and this is Vienna Past and Present,
where we walk through the gilded and sometimes not so gilded halls of Vienna's history.
In light of recent political events, we thought we'd zoom out just slightly from the Vienna focus to more of an Austria-wide view and take a look at an Austrian far-right figure that may have laid some of the groundwork for the recent election results. At the time of this recording, the far-right FPÖ party has come out on top in national elections. They haven't formed a government yet, but this is their best election result ever.
Right. It's clear now that they won't be in the government because no one wants to form a coalition with them. So I'm not sure exactly what that will mean down the line. As you said, Stephen, the elections were just a few weeks ago, and in Austria it's common that there are then a lot of discussions around forming a coalition, and that's currently the case. And the FPÖ will not be part of the coalition, even though they got the most votes. So It's a little unclear how that will play out down the line. On the one hand, it keeps them out of power for now, which I'm frankly pretty happy about, but it could strengthen their position for the next election. So kind of a toss-up.
Okay.
But anyway, historically, in the decades after World War II, they never got enough votes to even be in serious coalition discussions, but that all changed with the person we're talking about today.
Yeah, the person we're talking about today is Jörg Haider. It's tough to tell if he's known well outside Austria now, but he had a moment or two in the international news spotlight back in the late 90s and late 2000s when he rose to the very top of power with unapologetic anti-EU and anti-immigrant positions at a time when that was not very mainstream. So there's a lot of drama in this story. And this is just a Vienna past and present style overview, obviously. We'll give you the main drama as we see it. We'll also include articles and videos in the show notes if you want to delve deeper. Anyway, we thought it would be interesting to look back at this figure that may have seemed like an anomaly then, but appears to be more of a harbinger or a trendsetter today in right-wing movements in Austria, Europe, maybe even beyond.
Right, so just as a bit of background, the FPÖ is the far right-wing party in Austria today, and they have their roots in the post-war period. So, like elsewhere, they are very nationalistic, and they've been gaining momentum, in similar fashion that we see in other countries as well. And just as a little sidebar, maybe to make it a little bit easier, every party in Austria is associated with a color, and that's actually the way that Austrians usually talk about their parties too. A lot of the times people don't use the actual party name, they just will refer to the color of the party. So the FPÖ, the right-wing party that we're mainly talking about today, is the blue party.
Okay.
Whereas the historically two largest parties are the center-left SPÖ, which is red, and the center-right ÖVP, which is black.
Okay.
So basically, black and red have been the two main parties, and now blue has kind of become the third major party, and that's what we're talking about today.
Okay. And we don't want to make this a podcast about, breaking political news now, but, as we look at the political headlines, we think it's important in understanding the history of far-right movements in Vienna and Austria. At the very least, Haider made the FPÖ the party it is today. It doesn't get much more Vienna past and present than this.
Yeah, it's definitely about as present as it gets.
Right. So this is going to be a two-parter. We'll cover his family and childhood, his early political life, and his rise to power this time. Then, the rest in the next episode. I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who doesn't know how this ends. Okay, so let's go way back. His family background is quite interesting, I think. His parents were both members of the Austrian branch of a certain German National Socialist Party that went by another famous name and was quite a force in World War II. Excuse us as we talk around the YouTube filters that would probably get this show banned or delisted or whatever's happening right now. Thank you for that patience. His parents were members of the Austrian branch of that political party, and Haider's father joined when he was 15 years old. So this was well before a certain Adolf rose to prominence in that political party in Germany. To me, that's interesting because he didn't even need that charismatic leader. Haider's father was really into these concepts just by himself.
Yeah, that is saying something when you're joining, There's an expression in Austria that's used for people who joined in the first hour, right? Way at the beginning of this whole movement.
That's very interesting. Yeah, they seem to have very strong pan-German views, a viewpoint that Austria shouldn't be separate from Germany. That's politically right-wing, right? Do you know anyone personally? Is this a common view now in Austria, Carmen? I thought Austrians, found Germany totally annoying. I was not familiar with this view at all, actually.
I mean, I don't know anybody in my circles. Thankfully, I think. But
okay.
Yeah, it definitely is a right-wing thing, but it's not something I think that people would openly express really in public, because it is kind of this dog whistle where you kind of know exactly what it means.
Okay.
And, on the whole, yes, Austrians, for the most part, kind of really want to separate themselves from Germany or from Germans, but there is this kind of right-wing idea that comes out of, I think, more or less the collapse of the Habsburg Empire and the fact that you had all these countries that were then established out of that, and like the remainder was sort of the German-speaking bit, and then there was this idea that it should join with Germany.
Okay.
And that continues in far-right circles as a sort of, hearkening back to this, like, strong Germanic nation or something like that.
Anyway, Haider's father was very committed. He moved to Bavaria in 1933. He then returned to Austria just after a German-backed attempt to overthrow the Austrian government. That was in 1934. He was then arrested in Austria. He opted to move back to Germany. He completed 2 years of military training there, and then he returned to Austria only after it was annexed by Germany. So, a lot of border hopping, a lot of returning when things are good for Germany kind of vibes I'm getting there. He married Jörg's mother, Dorothea, in 1945, toward the end of the war. And did she just pick up her husband's hobbies then? No. She was a leader in an organization called the Band of German Maidens, an official party youth movement for girls. So she was very involved too, by herself, even before meeting her husband. After the war, his parents were investigated as part of a legal process that looked into former collaborators. They were considered compromised to a lesser degree, in quotes. His father then worked at a shoe factory, and his mother was actually prohibited from teaching for a few years, but then she eventually returned to it. So, from my American point of view, they weren't particularly penalized for what seems like pretty enthusiastic participation in the German side in the war. It's an interesting bit for me.
Yeah, that was pretty common in Austria. I think there was a lot of this superficial kind of justice in the post-war period without serious consequences for a lot of these people. So I think that's a pretty correct assessment. And it took a long time for Austria to really start looking at these things more closely.
Okay. Wow. So, yeah, I think it's hard to know exactly what was discussed or not in their home, but you have to wonder how that went in Jörg Haider's house when he was growing up. I mean, I'm sure he got a lot of these ideas, and I'm sure they talked openly about what they did, what they experienced, how they felt, all of those things, I would imagine.
And their viewpoints, surely. I mean, they were both apparently very committed to this from very early on.
Yeah, enthusiastic participants.
Right?
Yeah.
That has to come up at home, you would think.
Yeah.
All right, so what about Jörg himself?
So he got involved in politics early, like his parents did. I'll run through a little list of his credentials. I swear I'll make this quick, but there's an impressive amount here. He started in the youth movement of the FPO. When he joined it, the FPO was more of a mixed, bigger tent kind of party. There were liberal elements, but also very conservative pan-German views in the party too then. When he was 20, Haider became the leader of the FPO youth movement. He headed it for 5 years. He rose rapidly in the party ranks then. During this time, he got his law degree in Vienna.
Yeah. Well, I think he got a Juris Doctorate, right?
That sounds right.
Yeah, because when you see interviews and stuff with him, his followers or even just any, interviewers or whatever on TV would basically always use his title and call him Dr. Haider. But that's also a very Austrian thing, and it probably deserves its own episode at some point. But Austrians, and especially the Viennese, are really obsessed with academic titles. And also in his case, he was Dr. Haider all the time.
Interesting. So he was leader by 20. Then at 26, he was made party affairs manager of the Carinthian state FPO. By age 29, he was the youngest delegate of parliament. That was in 1979. So it's quite a rise, and he seems very persistent in his interest, like he has an affinity for politics already for me. He isn't somebody who came to it later in life. And I guess I'm calling that out because the videos and interviews that I saw, in translation, of course, or subtitles, they make it seem like he's more of a simple and ordinary and kind of like non-political vibe almost. So I was surprised to learn that he was so kind of persistent, so dogged about this from such an early age.
Yeah, true. Well, I think that's what made him very effective, right? He was very persistent and very focused on it, but then he also had a way of kind of speaking a little bit more colloquially when he wanted to. He kind of, he knew how to address his audience, and he knew how to kind of adjust his approach depending on if he was out in the street talking to people or if he was in some studio interview or... I even noticed when I saw some interviews with him where he was being interviewed by a German interviewer, He spoke more proper, like, High German than he did with an Austrian interviewer. So he did adjust how he spoke.
Okay, so this is like a literate, articulate person. Okay.
I think so, yeah.
So we're reaching the 1980s now. He had just been political his entire 20s. Carmen, can you give us an idea of what Austria was like in the 80s? Big question. I'll give you like 5 sentences.
Okay, well, here I go. I'll try. I was born in the 80s, so I don't remember very much of it, but...
That was the main event of the 80s in Austria, okay?
That was the highlight.
So we'll start there, yes.
Okay, but no, in terms of the political situation, so I mentioned before that you had these two other parties, the Red and the Black Party, which were center left and center right, and they had been this grand coalition that had been in power basically for the whole post-war period, and people were really getting sick of that coalition by the 1980s. They had been very dominant, and they had more or less built a system of consensus and power sharing between themselves, which worked for a while, but over time it led to complacency and inaction, and it began to fall apart by the 80s as people became very disillusioned with the complacency of these two parties.
Okay.
So then it was very fertile ground for disruption and for a politician like Haider to come in and kind of exploit this, vacuum that he saw. And then compounding all of that was that in the 80s you still have the Cold War going on, and Austria just geographically was in a bit of a vulnerable place. People had to build bomb shelters, there were bomb drills, all of these things. So a lot of that kind of fear and uncertainty was there. And then you had Chernobyl.
Right.
I think that was in 1986. And that was also a really big deal because a lot of the radioactive cloud that spread over Europe also spread over Austria, which really isn't that far away from the Ukraine. And so all of that together, I think, created a real cauldron of fear and uncertainty and, very similar to today in a lot of ways, I think. You sort of had this environmental catastrophe with Chernobyl, plus this disillusionment with the old, this grand coalition, right? The old powers that be, and people really looking for something to hold on to, or maybe something that really they thought had to change.
Okay, that sounds like a lot going on.
Yeah, I think a lot of parallels to today.
Right. So in 1983, Haider's in his early 30s. This is worth remembering. His policies became more confrontational. So that brings us to 1983. Haider's in his early 30s. He rose to party head of the Carinthian FPO, and he started to criticize the leaders of the FPO. His policies now were becoming more confrontational, his policies and his politics. At this point, the FPO was still a minor political movement in Austria. It was getting about 5 to 6% of the vote. That same year, and this is an interesting twist, I think, he inherited an estate in Carinthia, and he became wealthy. I mean, maybe not overnight, but kind of. So maybe this emboldened him too. This is kind of a side tangent. There's some questions around this estate and the inheritance. It may have been appropriated at an unfair price from an Italian Jew in the 1940s during the war, and the person who bequeathed it to Haider was not a blood relative. So the story has twists and turns. It's one the Austrian media looked into more than once. That's kind of an interesting side thing to Google if you're interested.
Yeah, I wonder what actually happened there, because when you read about it, there's lots of different details, and you kind of can't really wrap your head around it, so...
Right.
Something... maybe not super on the up and up.
Yeah, I feel like we looked into it a couple times for this episode, a couple ways, and I feel like you and I couldn't really find a consensus story. But, again, it's like we only have so much time to devote to these, so maybe that's its own focus at some point.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tangent, but, maybe just very quickly, though, Carinthia, because you've mentioned it a few times now, Carinthia is the southernmost state of Austria.
Yeah.
So it's one of the 9 states in Austria, and it's the southernmost one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks. Then in 1986, another big breakthrough came for Haider. He won the leadership of the FPO from the sitting vice chancellor. That's quite a coup for a 36-year-old at that point. He would actually remain leader of the FPO for the next 14 years.
I never realized how young he was for all of this. I mean, I kind of basically know the story and I know who he is. But going through this, it's wild to me actually how young he was when all of this happened.
Right. So now he is wealthy and landed. He is a leader of a party. He has this huge political career already behind him at 36. So this is where he starts to become more and more influential. Just to give a preview of where he took it, the FPO went from 5% in 1983 elections to 27% in 1999. Most of that time was under Haider's control. Was it because he came up with an incredibly nuanced long-term platform? I gather not. During this time, even when he changed political opinions relatively frequently, he was able to unite these scattered right-wing elements of the movement and movements around him with his personal relationships. That's kind of what I gather. That's what his colleagues at this time say. During this time, he spoke to nationalist, far-right, populist messages. He was able to gradually attract these disaffected voters from that great coalition government, that black and red that you talked about earlier. So here are some, we'll say, quote, remarkable episodes from his time as FPO party chairman at this phase. 2 years into his leadership, he called Austrian statehood, as separate from Germany, as a, quote, ideological monstrosity. Then, later in the 90s, as fewer Austrians identified with Germanness overall, he was then, at that point, calling the FPO a classic Austrian patriotic party. So, this kind of twist to me that shows his populist instincts, maybe populist talents. It's quite a policy pivot to pull off, if anybody's paying attention there. Some reorientations of political parties are happening in American politics right now, in my opinion. So I kind of felt that parallel very strongly, sitting here in Seattle.
Yeah, when I was reading through this and kind of, going through the notes and everything, there were so many points where I was like, oh, this sounds so much like what's going on today. So many parallels in Europe, in the US, and yeah, it's amazing how kind of the same rhetoric gets used and the same little tricks come up again and again. And I think one of them, is one of these, right, where he first says that this is an ideological monstrosity, but then when he realizes that, he needs to claim to be some Austrian patriot, that he can change tack very quickly.
Right, and then the people and his colleagues let him. I will just apologize for any barking you hear right now. Bo does not like this content. That's my dog here. We'll try to edit that out, but no promises.
Not a Haider fan?
I guess not. So this next part is probably unsurprising for most of us, but at this time he held consistent anti-Europe and anti-immigration views. I just called this out because I think it was a little bit more remarkable at this time, maybe, for such a prominent politician.
I mean, I don't know how common that was at the time, but it does feel like he was maybe one of the earlier people to be pushing this little...
adopters.
Yeah, this narrative.
One of these bits that seems particularly antiquated to me right now was his fights against minority rights within Austria, especially for non-German speaking minorities, like Slovenians who had been there for centuries already, who wanted Slovenian language road signs in Carinthia. This is a very American view maybe, but from outside the EU, I find that surprising. I just think, Americans see the EU as so forward-thinking in this respect. They really protect all their minority languages, and there's 58 official languages of the EU where you can get everything in your language, especially long-standing languages like this. So maybe there's a future episode there or something.
Yeah, there probably is a future episode there, but the road signs were a major flashpoint. It's still often mentioned today when talking about Carinthia. And
wow.
Yeah, so it's really, it sounds so trivial, and it's about road signs in 2 languages, but it was a massive fight at the time, and Haider was a big part of it. And it really had to do also, with how do you treat minority communities in your region.
Right. Okay, so it seems like we, probably run through everything. We haven't. I think we're now at his most controversial statement. It was in 1991 when he was explaining his employment plan to, quote, reduce freeloaders. Essentially, he made a statement that complimented German wartime employment policy. He credited Germany for having fewer unemployed people. He was shaming the Vienna government for, not being as good at it. The statement ended up costing him his seat as governor of Carinthia at that time in a no-confidence vote. But a few years later, he'd be voted back into that position. So it didn't ruin him. I read also at that time that people were surveyed and 1 out of 3 Austrians agreed with what he said. I can't even say the statement here because it's just full of that language that I think is being censored. So, but I gave you the gist. It was just very kind of upfront and made a splash, let's say.
I mean, it sounds incendiary. I don't know the quote specifically, but it's pretty scary if a third of Austrians still would more or less agree with a statement like that.
Yeah.
But I guess that shows you why this party is, as popular as it is,
right,
even today.
During that time, too, it is said by his colleagues that his party leadership became more authoritarian, more focused on his own viewpoints. that were shifting relatively quickly, like we alluded to earlier with Pan-Germanists. But it's also said that his own party members weren't interested in challenging that because they were winning elections at this point. Like, again, this sounds very familiar to an American sitting here in Seattle in 2024. Like, we have a party doing that as well, I think.
Yeah,
but yeah,
it just keeps, these kind of things just keep coming back, it seems like. Yeah.
Right. So his star just kept rising, both inside the party and outside. And that brings us to our final bit of the episode today. In 1999, the FPO under his leadership came in second in the national elections in Austria with 27% of the vote. Again, that's up from 5-ish% when he took over party leadership. When the Great Coalition tried to renew its government and failed, the leading Social Democrats reached out to the FPO to form a government. So they were in power for the first time. And at this point, Haider, as the leader of the party, should be a candidate for chancellor. But he was considered too controversial to be in the new national government. There was immediate backlash from the EU, even with open discussion of kicking Austria out of the Union. So he did not become chancellor as he would have normally in that position.
Yeah, very controversial. I remember this in the media at the time when it was happening.
Okay, and we were in high school at this point, right? So if it's like news that's reaching high schoolers, kinda, I feel like that's big.
Yeah, I only have very vague memories of this. Also, I think Austria was not in the news very much.
Right.
And, obviously being Austrian, having Austrian parents, when Austria came up, somehow my parents paid attention and therefore I probably heard about it too. But I know that this was a discussion and it was controversial, not just, in the EU, but there was also Israel had, some very choice words for him potentially being chancellor.
Oh, I bet.
There was a big backlash from lots of corners of the international community.
So, on that note, we're going to pause here and try to turn this into our first cliffhanger episode. In many ways, Austria was now at peak Haider. He went from a child in a right-wing political family whose past was swept under the rug to a star youth political leader to a charismatic, politically impulsive party leader to runner-up for chancellor, sort of. A lot.
Well, that is quite the rise, especially given how young he still was in all of this. But spoiler alert, there was also a fall, and we're going to get to that next time. So tune in next time to hear about how this all falls apart, actually, in the end.
So you'll want to tune in next time for the resolution here, okay? We will not leave you hanging here. Okay, well, that's it for today, right?
Yes, that's it for today. So thank you all for listening. If you liked what you heard, share with your friends or leave us a 5-star review. And if you didn't like it then, well, don't worry about that review.
You can find us on social medias, Vienna Past and Pres on Instagram, or send us your episode ideas at viennapastandpresent@gmail.com.
Auf Wiedersehen, pfiat euch, Papa.
Bye.